I once believed that science contained every answer worth knowing. As a professor of arts and head of my department at a prestigious university, I prided myself on my ability to interpret the world through logic and tangible evidence. In my eyes, human reason reigned supreme, and any notion of God or a higher power seemed backward or delusional. If anything was divine, it was the mind, my mind. I decided which facts mattered and which ideas were too foolish to consider. Over time, this perspective hardened into a prideful shell, keeping me aloof from mysteries that lay beyond my comfortable boundaries. This is how Howard Storm remembers his outlook for much of his adult life. He had earned respect for his scholarly work, and students looked to him for guidance in the arts. Yet at 38, his certainties were shattered by a health crisis so severe it nearly claimed his life. During that episode, he insists he found himself on the threshold of hell, an encounter that forced him to reconsider everything he thought he knew. In my hospital bed lay someone who looked exactly like me. The turning point came as Storm traveled through Europe with his wife and several students. For 3 weeks, they explored museums and historical landmarks. One Saturday in Paris, a city renowned for its cultural riches, Storm felt a sudden, wrenching pain in his abdomen. He later described it as an inferno raging deep within his body. Collapsing to the floor of the hotel, he was rushed by ambulance to a local hospital. There, doctors discovered a perforation in his stomach. This dire condition called for immediate surgery, but the hospital was understaffed. No surgeon was available at that critical moment. Storm was left in a stark, impersonal ward, relying on minimal help from nurses who came by only to say they still hadn't found a doctor. An older Frenchman in the next bed witnessed Storm's agony and tried to comfort him with kind words, but the relief was fleeting at best. Eventually, Storm turned to his wife and quietly admitted he was dying. Given his belief that death meant total oblivion, the finality of this admission weighed on him like a crushing force. Unable to cope with the pain, he drifted into unconsciousness. Suddenly, I was standing, and the pain had vanished. Storm doesn't know how long he was out. What he does recall is that he jolted awake to find himself upright, with no trace of the searing agony he'd felt minutes before. Bewilderment set in when he noticed his hospital bed was not empty. Lying in it was a person who looked exactly like him in every detail. He froze, feeling that such a thing defied all natural laws. Fearing he was losing his mind, he decided not to dwell on the impossibility and looked instead to the door, which stood ajar. In the dim corridor beyond, Storm saw several blurry figures beckoning him forward. Desperate for any sign of help, he asked if they were there to take him to surgery. One of them responded with a statement that set his nerves on edge. "We know what you need. Follow us." Hoping he might finally receive the life-saving operation, Storm left the ward, and with it, his wife, who seemed oddly unaware of what was happening. The shapes guided him down a corridor that grew steadily darker. With each step, the light from the ward receded until only a murky gloom surrounded them. When Storm attempted to ask questions, the figures responded with clipped, impatient tones. At last, he refused to move any farther, sensing that something was horribly wrong. That was the moment they turned on him. With frightening swiftness, hands emerged from the darkness, shoving and dragging him. He tried to resist, but more appeared, scratching and clawing at his arms and legs. Storm fell to the floor under their relentless assault, convinced he was about to be torn to pieces. All the while, he could hear their mocking laughter, a sound devoid of any empathy or warmth. In that frenzy, a voice, possibly his own, urged him to pray. Though he had long regarded prayer as little more than superstition, he found himself desperately trying to recall fragments of prayers from his youth. To his astonishment, Those halting words had a tangible effect. The tormentors reeled back, as though something invisible now shielded him. Their laughter and jeers faded, leaving Storm shaken and alone in the darkness. I knew I was here because of how I'd lived. Alone in that silent void, Storm realized he had entered a place suited to those who recognized no higher principle than themselves. He sensed he wasn't in the deepest pit of suffering, but the beings there had done their best to drag him further into despair. Fearful of what lay ahead, he stayed put. In an act of sheer desperation, he began pleading for forgiveness. He had no idea who might hear his plea, only that it sprang from the most vulnerable corner of his soul. Gradually, a gentle light began to pierce the gloom. Within that light, Storm witnessed scenes from his own life. Biting remarks he made to his mother, conflicts with his father, and instances where he dismissed his students' worries or dreams. None of his professional milestones appeared. It was as though only his relationships and his capacity for kindness or cruelty mattered in that stark review of his existence. Then, as suddenly as it began, the pull of that dark realm ended. Storm felt himself drawn away, and when he opened his eyes, he was once again in his physical body. Nurses scrambled around him, and at last, a surgeon had been located to perform the critical operation. Weak and disoriented, Storm met his wife's gaze. Eager to tell her the incredible story, he described the corridor of shadows, the vicious assault, and the almost miraculous power of the prayers he had spoken in desperation. My wife thought I was delirious, but it was more vivid than ordinary life. When Storm tried to explain his experience, every detail of the chilling laughter, the intangible darkness, and the final emergence of light, his wife assumed he was delirious, suffering from the trauma of his near-fatal condition. But to Storm, nothing could have been clearer. Every moment in that shadowy place seemed seared into his memory with a sharpness he had never known before. In the weeks and months that followed, he struggled to reconcile what he had felt with his prior belief that nothing existed beyond the physical realm. Yet the recollection of being utterly helpless against malevolent forces, until he prayed, refused to fade. In time, Storm concluded that the worldview he once championed was incomplete. If he could experience something so drastically outside the scope of material science, perhaps reality was broader than he ever allowed himself to imagine. Eventually, he chose to leave the university where he taught and pursued ordination as a pastor, devoting himself to spiritual matters he had once dismissed out of hand. My entire perspective on life changed forever. Today, Howard Storm shares his story openly, granting interviews and speaking in churches or community gatherings. He replays that haunting darkness in his mind, the primal fear, the relentless cruelty, and the sinking realization that his scholarly achievements gave him no protection at all. He also describes the liberation he felt when a single plea for divine help seemed to repel the tormenting figures. As far as Storm is concerned, what he experienced was more authentic than any lecture he ever delivered or any research he ever conducted. At 67, he continued to stand by every word of his account, acknowledging that many listeners remain skeptical. Still, he insists that the borderline between life and what follows is thinner than we dare suspect, and that stepping across it, if only for a moment, can redefine all we hold true. He believes our brief time on earth matters profoundly because it shapes the core of who we are, and we carry those moral truths beyond this life. Science alone couldn't rescue me. Humility and prayer did. Storm no longer claims humanity as the highest authority in all things. While he respects the power of logic and discovery, he argues that these forces fall silent in the face of a spiritual dimension we have yet to chart by microscopes or equations. The single act of remembering childhood prayers, he says, did more than volumes of textbooks could in that dire situation. It was a raw, honest appeal for mercy, and it appeared to shift the entire tide of that hellish confrontation. He now encourages people to reflect on the possibility that our choices, especially the ones involving kindness, empathy, and humility, carry a weight we might only realize when we stand at the threshold between life and death. In Howard Storm's view, what saved him wasn't evidence or rational thought, but the recognition that he needed help beyond himself. It's a lesson he believes is crucial for everyone, regardless of their background or belief. He stresses that no matter how certain we are of our own intellect or status, we may one day face a reckoning where compassion and a sincere willingness to ask for grace prove far more decisive than any academic credentials. And so, the man who once scoffed at prayer and believed science to be the pinnacle of all understanding now stands firm in declaring that love, humility, and openness to a higher reality can ultimately mean the difference between despair and salvation. Having stepped back from the brink of what he can only call hell, Howard Storm continues to recount his story, urging others to value the intangible bonds that unite us as human beings, and to remember that beyond the threshold of life may lie an entirely different reality, one shaped by the depth of our compassion and the courage of our faith.